So today, we're super excited to welcome, obviously, you, members, non-members, a number of supporters of Feedback Madagascar and Friends of Madagascar have joined us as well. We have members in mid-air. We've got a gentleman, Ashley Leftwich, who is currently at 37,000 feet flying to Madagascar, might be joining us. Ben Gaskell, who was a member from the 80s and 90s in the AMS, has come back and is joining us. We also may have Darren Andre dialing in from a stadium waiting to see Nottingham Forest kick off from a football match. And I believe Brett Massoud is battling the torrential rains in Fort Dauphin to join us. And if that's not enough, we are also expecting David Ashley, Her Majesty's Ambassador to Madagascar, to join us also. But I think what we're most excited about is shortly we're going to have Jamie Spencer, co-founder of Feedback Madagascar, to come and talk to us about what's been going on in Madagascar for Feedback, and obviously after all the cyclones have wrought their havoc through Madagascar. And obviously we've been keeping you updated on Facebook and through emails about that, but we're going to hear and hopefully see some of the updates and information and progress that's been going on there. And then we're really excited to also have Alison Richard with us, who has, as many of you know, is an anthropologist and conservationist, and the 344th Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. So all in all, I think there's a blockbuster show, and I think without any further ado, I'm going to hand the session over to Jamie, who is going to attempt to share his screen, and we're all going to go on mute. I'll mute you all if not, and let him take over. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I think actually one of the last times I saw him, he was out here working with us, putting out offcuts of solar panels, which were extremely expensive in those days. And somehow Chris managed to get hold of offcuts from various solar companies and was distributing them all over the countryside. So it's lovely to see you again, Chris. Right, I'm really going to just talk to you about the cyclones which struck us so severely in the area that we work. And I've put together a mass of slides, so I'll show them to you in various blocks, and there's a few little videos, and I'm going to explain to you really how things were and are now. But first of all, like, an enormous thank you to the Anglo-Malagasy Society. We didn't have any money for a response to the cyclone. We're not an emergency relief organization, and you guys jumped on it immediately and sent out £1,500. And I know also many individuals who are watching this now also gave. So many, many thanks. Just so you know, £1,500 converts to about 34 of the emergency kits we provided for households straight away, and that would reach and look after 200 people. So a huge, huge thank you, and it's lovely to have an opportunity to say this to you directly. Okay, Malagasy speakers will recognize the writing on that boulder. Asatana Batsarai, the handiwork of Batsarai. That boulder was just one element. It rolled all the way down from the top of that hill, and underneath it was a school, one of the schools that we do school feeding in. Luckily, nobody was in it, but obviously there's no school there now. That's just one example. My name is Jamie Spencer. I'm the director of Feedback Madagascar. We've been there working in Madagascar for 30 years now. Since 2002, in partnership with our local partners that we helped found Nitan and Sikia. I must mention two very important people, Eugenie Rarisson and Sam Cameron, who many of you know, who are really the heavy workers in the organization. They now operate with a personnel of 200 people. We work in the around the forest corridor of Kofav, from Fandriana in the north down to Vandruzu in the south. Many of you might know Ranamafana, that kind of cuts through the corridor in the middle. And we work with offices in Ambustra in the north, up there, and down in Finarantsu. And we work on both sides of the forest corridor, on the high plateau on the west, and then down at the low altitudes on the east. And currently we're working with 470 villages, and our work is fully integrated development and conservation, which ends up being major development work in education, agriculture, health, everything else that's needed to put people in a position where they can afford not to exploit the forest. Now, 5th of February, we were getting on with our day-to-day activities, and then suddenly, the 5th of February, Batsarai came in. Unbelievably, 26th of February, on exactly the same trajectory, Mnati on the 22nd of February, and literally it passed right through the middle of our work zone, and some of the villages where we're working sadly had the highest death rates and some of the worst damage. And I'm just going to show you some pictures of the days after. Most of them are from Batsarai, the first one. A school. Some might know the bridge at Ranamafana, just to show you how high the water was. That's a swimming pool you might know in Ranamafana. On the plateau, hundreds of thousands of houses were lost across the area. That's actually a health center. So I wanted to share with you just kind of how it went for us. Before Batsarai, we were all watching it on our apps and computers coming in from the Indian Ocean and the ever-changing trajectory, and just hoping it wouldn't hit us. The government declared no work days on the 4th and the 5th, so everybody could batten down the hatches. We were getting everybody to, getting in touch with everybody while they were still in phone contact, charge their phones, get all the valuables, get all your important documents in safe, high areas, get any equipment secured, and just try and communicate with as many people as possible. We have over 130, 40 agents living out in the villages in the field. So they would be telling folk to get their animals in, identify where they're going to weather the storm, the most secure buildings, often concrete cyclone-proof schools that we've built, or maybe municipality buildings. And sadly, a lot of people in the countryside who didn't have radio reception got limited information. And another thing that was unfortunate was for the Ambalavao district south of Finarantsu on the plateau, which includes Ambu-Mamasana and Andringatra, they got the wrong coding. They got a coding for a lesser storm, so they weren't as prepared as perhaps they might have been. So I'll deal with Batsarai. The first one, the wind started building in the afternoon, and then by 1 o'clock in the morning, they were over 100 miles an hour. And of course, just tearing off roofs and blowing down houses, and the forest with trees were getting lost. And then, not immediately, but pretty soon in the middle of the night, the rains followed. Heavy, relentless rains. And this was dire. Interestingly, for me, because I hadn't been down that way for a while, many of the buildings now are adobe, built from mud, because there's less wood available, it's very expensive, and it's discouraged its use should it be coming from the forest. And of course, adobe just melts basically in the rain. So some of those strange pictures where you just see piles of mud, they were houses. And the rivers rose incredibly. I'll show you pictures shortly. Landslides. These were some of the most devastating things. And Karambelu municipality, where 44 people died, 35 of them were from landslides. And I know of one family of 8, their whole house was just crushed. And then in neighboring Antadinga, another 31 people died, again, mostly in landslides. And during the night of the storm, in the villages where there was a concrete building, that's where everybody would have been sheltering. And you can imagine, terrifying. I was in Tanner at the time, and speaking with friends on telephones who were sheltering in these houses, and you could hear the fear. You could hear people crying, and they were talking about how people were getting sick from fear and sick with fevers. And then the next day, the winds had abated. It was still raining, and when dawn broke, the big fear was the rivers kept on rising. And yeah, all the low villages and fields were underwater, and all the high ones were basically devastated. But the brave people went out to retrieve what they could, and of course to protect anything of theirs from theft, which sadly is an inevitable consequence. We, as an organization, we started our long and complex process of contacting our staff to confirm that they were all right, and to start getting situation reports. All our staff were fine, thank goodness, but it took a while to hear, and the last one actually couldn't get a message to us for 2 weeks up north in Ambuimira, north of Ranamafana National Park. No phone works, no phone networks, and no paths or bridges. A few more pictures here of, yeah, this is a principal artery to Miaranarivu, which has, I don't know, about 50,000 people living over there, where we work in numerous projects and school feedings, and now we have to porter things about 15 kilometers to get to our main depot. This is the road just up west of Ranamafana, the RN25. So that is the road that goes to the whole of the east, the middle east of Madagascar. It goes to Mananzar, Manakar, Vuipenu, Vangandrano, Nilsivaraka. So yeah, that was broken. So you can imagine just the chaos that ensues. Here more floods. That's actually Vuiparar, up again on the west of Ranamafana. This, I think, is down in Vuipenu, or perhaps Ikungu, where we work. People swimming in the main street. And this is what I wanted to mention. This is on the road to Mbuma Masana. Those railings at the bottom came from the top of that bridge. So when you look at this wee burn, and then you imagine the height and the width of the water, and this was commonplace everywhere we went. We would get reports of villages being washed away, and it just made no sense, because normally you're used to looking at a little river way down. So yeah, that gives you some impression. And so yeah, what we did back in the office, we launched our appeal, emailing our supporters and posting on social media. Of course, as I said, we had no money, but incredibly, your good selves and many others just coughed up very quickly. And we raised £100,000, and some is still coming in. So thank you again for everybody's support. Another task was to try and coordinate and collaborate with other organizations, especially the specialist emergency relief organizations, who started to appear after a few days. We perhaps wasted a bit of effort here, as in fact everybody ended up going down to the coastal towns, which, yes, they were hit very bad, but it did end up there being quite a bottleneck of aid down there, and no one really wanting, well, no one wanting to come up to the remote areas near the forest, where sadly so much suffering was going on. But thanks to your immediate generosity, we were able to start planning help. And fantastically, because of all our agents on the ground, and because we have such a solid logistics network set up for our school feeding program, which we're feeding in 470 schools, we were in a very good place to get on with things. So although we weren't, or not, well, maybe we are now, although we weren't an emergency relief organization, factors led to us being able to act. It did take quite a while to build a picture of what was going on. And of course, the slowest reports to come in tended to be from the most needy and most desperate in the most remote places. But our staff got messages through, often literally via running messengers between bridgeless rivers and throwing reports across the banks. And in our offices in Fianna and Boostra, extraordinary people, mayors and community leaders walking in sometimes 60 miles with their tales and their reports and their requests for help. So we started to make our action plan, and it had to be dynamic because the scenario was changing all the time, and it still is. And it was a combination of people without houses, polluted water, no food. Of course, the harvest was due and any minute, and it was all washed away. So folk had just endured the hungry period. Schools, health centres, many gone, many damaged, roads, bridges, no electricity in many of the places, solar panels disappeared. So many people had nothing. And then another terrible thing for the future, as this lady is demonstrating, is fields were destroyed, either washed away or dumped on by millions of tons of sand and boulders. And this is a huge problem for progressing now in the future. So there's a lady in what was a rice field nearly ready to go. The first activity we chose to do was to put together kits, sort of relief packages for households. So let me just, oh, here we go. First of all, sorry, I'll just show you some more pictures of fields that have been destroyed, even terraced fields destroyed by landslides. So we put together emergency kits. We've so far distributed over 1,000 of them. And in them, for example, 20 kilos of rice, enough for a family for a month, maybe, 10 kilograms of beans and pulses, salt, oil, infant porridge, a bucket, a cooking pot, spoons, plates, blankets, polythene for cover, clothes, a solar lamp, a few solar radios per village for information, school jotters, pens, seeds for replanting, and for those that had to walk in, money for their travel costs for buying food on the way. And what I want to show you now is we've done 3 distributions. And this was the first one we did for Ankarambelu. And the only practical way to do it was to get to the road end at Ambuima Masana, and then ask these poor people at the end of their tether to walk the 45 kilometers, 45 kilometers across the forest back up the plateau to come and collect it. And so here are staff putting together the packages. So this first distribution was 500 kits for 3,000 households, for 3,000 people, sorry, 500 households, 3,000 people. They came all right. and extraordinarily all ages. You'll see a 70-year-old lady at the moment who's going to talk to us. That's just folk arriving in the Anglo-Malagasy. That's one of the vans that's dropping off some of the goods. We also had to hurry to get the handouts out, so these guys would have time, a good day, to get home, because Mnati was due to come in a couple of days. So they arrived mostly at night, about 1,000+ people coming in pairs, and we were ready to feed them all. And then again the next morning to give them breakfast and to explain what was, what was in the kits. Now, one point I'd like to mention, those who've worked in this business, you might know how hard it is to give and to do good. One of the hardest and biggest responsibilities we had was the dreaded lists. Who was on the list to receive help and who wasn't? And we had to work very closely with the local authorities to produce the lists, to make sure the most needy people were on it, and those undeserving, or not undeserving, but who are perhaps better off, were not. And sometimes it took 3 revisions of these lists, and some pretty hard-nosed choices had to be made. And thankfully, we had local knowledge of situation and people from our agents on the ground. Not only does this make sure the most desperate get the most help, but very importantly, avoids any perceived injustices which could help break down cohesion and community spirit, which of course that unity and cohesion is such an important force for people to help rebuild together. So here we are handing out, registering people before they receive their handouts, and they're getting their money for food for their to and fro journeys. This is them receiving. And here's one lady, we got Sam's put together some subtitles here.
Da nierikandro de cyclone na tondraky tany zay aboabo zay natao hoe mampalahelo anay tamin'ny fonenana nisy anay fa ry magnaraka an'izany ny tanimbary sy ny tanimboly kesa vita varmena na voasindry ny tany toaraka ny voalaza zao aby de zay mampalahelo anay fa da tena voa de voa hay eo afotanin'ny zorozoro am'izao voalazako zao. Misy maty efatry ny zavatra tokony itokonana simba daholo tragno robaky. Da misaotra anareo manapay fanaovako ana sy zoko izay e. Ary da tena faly hay indray nisy ny zavatra nahazo anay teny amin'ny fisonjovanareo anay io. Izay.
And here, going home after the collection. And of course, where folk died, there was over a week of funerals. And here in Faliarivu, which is in the municipality of Nkarembelu, there were many folk died there. And you can see on the hillsides, you see the brown landslides everywhere. That just gives you an idea of how many there were. And then down in the foreground almost, the muddy terraces and rice paddies. So, and of course, the forest the forest and the natural world suffered terribly too. And I just walked across the forest a week ago, and I saw endless landslides, as common as those ones you just saw on in the crop fields. And particularly the taller, older trees many of them have come down, possibly, particularly weak because of a year-long drought that we've had, and then recent rains just before the cyclone, so possibly unstable earth. And reports of lemurs found washed up in the floods and on the forest floor, blown out of trees, and chameleons and all sorts. And reports of people burying lemurs, which is a new thing to us. Of course, the winds in the forest and the floods. Imagine the floods taking out huge areas. So any wildlife living alongside the water banks, the river banks, very affected. But for the forests, of course, the biggest threat starts now when people are desperate. And if we cannot find alternatives for their survival as quickly as possible, they're obviously going to turn to the forest. So they're going to look for food, for products to sell, they're going to look for food, they're going to try growing in hidden valleys and slopes. So to reduce this threat, we must help people as much as we can and as fast as we can. Now, a resume of what we've done so far. We've distributed over 1,000 kits for 6,000 people, and we carry on to do this. We're carrying out cash distribution in partnership with the World Food Programme. For 3 months, we give some money to each household to help them out, and this has been distributed to 57,000 people in the area. It's an enormous operation. We've repaired or decontaminated 100 boreholes for 30,000 people. We've put in public water tap stands in the centre of Ikungu town, which was particularly hit and has got many visitors. So very important to have clean, healthy water for visitors there. We've donated, I don't know how many wheelbarrows and spades to people to clear the thousands and thousands of tons of boulders and sand. We've started food for work regime where we, and so far 8,800 days we've committed, paying in food to community members who have helped us install 22 new boreholes for clean drinking water. We've restarted our school feeding program that we do with Mary's Meals, and that's for 76,000 children getting fed, and in 470 schools. Where there are no schools, there are hundreds, I can't remember how many have been totally destroyed, but many have been totally destroyed, and many have lost their roofs, etc. We're doing distribution of food in homes. And where we can, we're adding extra food for the whole family, for the most destitute. From now on, our main focus is to repair and rebuild schools and health centres. If we have the funds to build our cyclone-proof concrete schools, then we will, but they're £30,000 each. Equally, we want to rebuild and solar energise that costs a similar amount. I visited one last week, a health centre which had been blown apart, and the doctor and the sage-femme, the midwife, were down to one room, and there was a lady giving birth in the same room as sick people with infectious diseases. It was a pitiful sight. But meanwhile, until we get sort of significant funds to rebuild, we're just going to work with folk to try and help repair roofs and walls and do the best we can. The faster we work, the better. The situation is not good now. As you know, there's no food because there was no harvest. What food is around in the markets is hugely expensive. Many places I went twice the normal price. Yes, sadly, the effects of the war in Ukraine will reach here too on that account. and desperate people are turning to petty theft and thieving crops, surviving crops from each other. One colleague said cyclones kill cultures, which is not far off. And the requests on our desks from the mayors in the village just keep piling up, getting higher and higher. But people are resilient and incredibly positive, and using this approach of working in partnership to maximize results, to rebuild things. We're just hoping to do the best we can. I'll show you a few wee shots. Here's one of our schools that survived. This is east of Anglo-Malagasy. Again, I chose this also because you can see there's 2 or 3 landslides there in the forest. This is on the forest edge. And here we go, rebuilding. Everybody's rebuilding. That's what's going on now. So I just want to thank you again for all your help, for reacting so generously and so fast. And if I can, I'd like to thank Sam, who's sitting right beside me, and all our team who've put in so much. And yeah, together, guys, we're doing something good. I think we're doing our best. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Maybe if you stop sharing your screen, we can ask for some questions. But equally, on behalf of the AMS, we were so pleased to be able to help modestly, but also amplify the message to everyone of what was needed, you know, the support that everyone has given, we're hugely grateful for, and equally for the work that you're doing, and Sam and the team in Madagascar. So to the guests that are all online, questions please. Ulrika Meinhof, how you doing? Okay, hold on.
Yeah,
We've got a...
Well, thank you very much, although for this very shocking report. I just wondered whether there's any machinery helping those fields to get the soil, you know, all the earth of the fields again, to make those rice fields again functionable. Because obviously, you know, the food packaging is fine, but long term, what you really need is the fields to get reactivated. So I wondered whether there's any, or whether that's naive. I mean, I know how difficult it is to get to these areas. I struggled to get there myself. But
yeah, Ulrika, as soon as I saw the first field, that was my first thought too. And no, absolutely no. It's Angadi and spades. And I just can't imagine. I don't know.
Wow, my God.
People just have to do their best. Yeah.
What are the United Nations doing to help?
Well, as I said, we've been working with the World Food Programme, distributing cash, which seems to be quite a standard emergency relief package, cash for 3 months. And that's, we were given a couple of big tents, which we carried into some remote areas that no longer had health centres. So, and apart from that, I don't think there's anything else around the corridor. And like I said, they've all concentrated down on the coast, which had enormous flooding, but all importantly, they've still got access on the coast. So they're mostly working down on the coast.
And what will happen to children's vaccinations?
Well, slowly but surely, they will come back to, they will get back to what level they were at. They depend often on refrigeration and solar panels. So for the moment, in many places, they're not happening. But as bridges slowly get rebuilt, I mean, for example, where I was the other day, there was a big village discussion about how can we repair the bridges? Can we use fallen wood from the forest? We were of the opinion, yes, this is an excellent sustainable use, not to encourage other forest use, but where the forest will actually serve people. Of course, there's procedures, you've got to get permissions from the forest authorities, etc. But yeah, it's going to take an awful lot of uplift, as it were, before they can get the vaccination programs back to where they were.
A question from Alison Leaf. Alison.
Hi, Jamie. Fantastic to hear what you're doing. I'm just really wondering, how well has the government been able to respond? I mean, given that it's a totally national crisis, but particularly with things like road. I mean, that picture you showed of the road completely fallen in, obviously communications, so roads and bridges. How well has the government been able to step?
Yeah, I'm afraid extremely limited, because they don't have any money. Which is why, yes, for example, that example of repairing bridges, it's up to the communities with assistance from the likes of ourselves, because there just isn't anything in the local government's kitties or seemingly in the central government's kitties.
Yeah, thank you. Depressing.
But that said, they have repaired, for example, that road that was down in Ranamafana, the main artery. But my head's always in the, you know, on the secondary roads.
Right. Thank you.
Well, Jamie, I just want to say again a huge thank you for joining us from Madagascar to give this presentation. And I'm sure that we can continue via the Anglo-Malagasy website and our various social media activities to promote the work of Feedback Madagascar, as well as other organizations. So if anyone would like to make a donation, please continue to do so. You can contact Feedback Madagascar directly, or go on to the Anglo-Malagasy website, and there are links on our useful links page. We're going to prepare to have Alison join us in a moment, but I also spotted in the gallery that our ambassador, David Ashley, is with us. And if I may, I'd like to invite David to say a few words about how things are in Madagascar, how the government has responded, possibly to the British government has helped out with the cyclone, etc. So, David, I know you're on leave, so it's a double pleasure that you've been able to join us, and we've torn you away from some rest and relaxation. But David.
Thanks, Chris. It's hardly rest and relaxation, because we're moving house in the UK, and so it's much harder work than it is. It's much harder work than it is in Tanna most of the time.
I've just done that, so I appreciate moving house. Yeah.
But thanks very much. I would say, and thanks, Jamie, for the presentation. Apologies for joining slightly later. I had the pleasure of joining Jamie and Sam and colleagues a couple of weeks ago now to see some of the work feedback in the areas of working, including cyclone, the effects of the cyclone. It was really impressive to see the fruits of the long-standing commitment that feedback has made in that region, and therefore the relationships they have with both with the local authorities but more importantly, local people. And obviously I can't add to what Jamie said about either the impacts of the cyclone there or feedback's work, but it was genuinely impressive and heartwarming to see how aid given through feedback was making real impact on people's lives there. I had previously been the week before to the east to the areas of Manakara and Manzar, which were also badly affected by the cyclone. The physical effects on Manzar in particular are very obvious still, and that's where Batsarai kind of had the winds associated with Batsarai kind of had a still a very visible impact. Elsewhere, as Jamie set out, I mean, the impact has to a large extent been about the rains and the destruction that caused to fruit trees and rice fields and other crops, and therefore on food security moving forward. The UK contribute £1 million to the post-cyclone effort. 500,000 to the International Federation of the Red Cross, 500,000 to UNICEF to support water, sanitation, shelter, food, and other support. I think again, it was impressive to see the efforts being made on the East Coast. You know, the fact that while I actually saw the last people leaving the displaced people centres and going home, seeing the shelter kits which have been provided, seeing food being distributed, visiting where people are being you know, helped to not necessarily reconstruct their homes, because most people are already doing that themselves, but how to strengthen, how to use the additional materials to strengthen so that they're better equipped for future cyclones. So all of that, and all of that was good to see, and the aid effort, at least on the East Coast, was well coordinated. As Jamie said, it was not, you know, unfortunately there was probably less attention given to areas inland which were also affected by the cyclone. My colleagues also visited the south a week or so back to see the areas affected by the Kere. A slightly positive picture there in terms of, I think the nutrition and food security situation is significantly better than it was a few months ago, thanks to two things. One is the sort of significant international aid effort, which has meant that nutrition levels among children and also elderly people has improved, but also the, you know, rain is both a blessing and a curse, and obviously the fact that there was some rains in the south was a blessing, and should lead to a normal harvest for this year. But it will be important not to be complacent. Just one normal harvest is not going to suddenly reverse the effects of repeated years of drought. So I think we'll see more early recovery efforts and resilience efforts there. I probably have spoken for too long, so maybe I'll stop there. Obviously, I'm always happy to talk more generally, including on the politics, and Madagascar's not totally helpful position on Ukraine and so on and so forth. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's great to hear from you, and obviously we wish you luck with the house move. So look, I think without further ado, we should invite Alison Richard to join us now. She's going to be sharing her screen shortly, and just quickly to give you some background, as I said at the head of this, the start of this call, or this meeting, Alison is an anthropologist, a conservationist, a vice chancellor of Cambridge University, and has been involved with Madagascar for a number of decades, let's say that. And we're really delighted to hear her present some ideas and findings from her recently published book, The Sloth Lemur's Song, Madagascar from the Deep Past to the Uncertain Present. So Alison, may I invite you to share your screen?
Not yet. I just want to speak for
or,
a bit.
or just share your thoughts. That's it.
Yes,
Alison,
I'll talk a bit, and then I want to show some slides and then talk a bit more. But first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor. And I would also say it's actually very daunting. It's doubly daunting, in fact. It's very daunting because you all know a lot about Madagascar. And as I look at this gallery, there are people that I see who have done some of the work that I'm going to be talking about today. So, I don't know what it is that I can really tell you. And then having just listened to Jamie, it becomes daunting in another way, which is, so what business do I have whittering on about vegetarian crocodiles and dinosaurs and so forth when we listen to what he has to say? My response to that is that I think there has to be a place for wonder and magic in this world of ours, in this dark world. But also, I will argue at the end of what I have to say that that this dive into the past is relevant to the present and indeed to the future. So so going back, so thank you very much for sort of glossing over how many decades it is that I've been involved in Madagascar, Chris. So I went there for the first time in 1970 as a graduate student, so it's 5 decades. Anyway, there are 3 threads to my life that came sort of from that shortly from that time, as some of you will know. And one is a thread of doing research on the social systems of lemurs. And a second is a thread of grassroots conservation and collaboration with a local community in southwest Madagascar, near the Besamar Valley. And the third came about when I met this lovely chap in 1974, who was an archaeologist who came to work in Madagascar, my late husband, Robert Dewar, who opened my mind up to thinking in broader and deeper ways about Madagascar's history. And this book that I've just finished is a sort of, it weaves all of those threads together. Where it started out, or what it started out as, was a challenge to the prevailing wisdom about Madagascar, which is that it was an entirely forest-covered island in which these wonderful, charismatic, big animals roamed until people arrived and they promptly burned the forest, cut it down, and exterminated all these big animals in one fell swoop. Whatever the truth was, whatever really happened, it was certainly more complicated than that. And where I began was with wanting to kind of knock that story for 6. However, as in the course of sort of the journey of writing the book, I became more and more bewitched simply by the long history of the island, and before it was an island, which became sort of just of interest to me in itself, in its own right. And that's really mostly what I wanted to share with you this morning, very briefly. I'm mindful of the time, and it's Saturday afternoon in England, and you should be doing other things than sitting in front of Zoom. So now we see whether my technologically challenged self can share a screen. Oh, wonderful, I'm amazed. So the first point is that Madagascar has been a place of change. I mean, that is really sort of a main point. Madagascar has been a change. It wasn't always an island. 170 million years ago, it was just this wedge of land in the middle of Gondwana, stuck between Africa and India, mainly. And then as with the passage of time, you see Gondwana, which was moving around on the face of the globe, and in fact was over the South Pole at one point. Imagine Madagascar over the South Pole. When you get to somewhere between 135 and 125 million years ago, the first significant breakup of Gondwana from Madagascar's point of view is its separation from Africa. Look at where the Tropic of Capricorn, Madagascar and indeed Africa were far south of where they are today. But Madagascar is still firmly embedded on the western flank of India and not yet an island. You come to 100 million years ago, the Mozambique Channel is opening up further. South America is kind of marching off to the left. I think this plate tectonic stuff is so great. I love talking about it, continents moving around. Anyway, you get to 88 million years, which is the best estimate now of the geologists and geophysicists for Madagascar becoming an island surrounded by quite deep water. But if you come to 60 million years ago, you can see Madagascar is still far south of where it is today. Today, the Tropic of Capricorn runs through just sort of right at the bottom of the southern end of the island, and Africa too is further north than it is. So there is a journey in space and in the surrounding continents that is going on. And while that journey is happening, Madagascar is home to a parade of amazing critters. I'm not going to go into that here, but I just put up my favorite because as a symbol of the extraordinary fauna that the island has been home to, and as an island, as Madagascar has been home to as an island, but also before it was an island. This is Beelzebufo madagascariensis, a giant, certainly predatory, probably dinosaur-eating frog, in comparison to the scale of a living frog. So Beelzebufo, known to those who discovered it as variously the frog from hell or the hopping head, lived 68 million years ago. Its remains have been found up in the northwest in the Majunga Basin. And those remains have been found along with at least 7 species of dinosaurs, flying dinosaurs, a vegetarian crocodile. I mean, Dr. Seuss couldn't have made it up. Anyway, it was an extraordinary, rich and diversified fauna, living in a quite green and pleasant land, Madagascar was flat at that point, but quite sort of green and pleasant and well watered. 66 million years ago, an asteroid hits Earth in the Gulf of Mexico. 75% of the land animals of the world go extinct, including, as far as we can tell, virtually everything in Madagascar. I can come back to sort of what remains, but it's almost nothing. I mean, it's unimaginable. This island was just sort of emptied of its critters. And of course now it's 400 kilometers off the coast of Africa with very deep water. So the only way you can get there is to fly or to float, which tortoises eventually did. Bats and birds flew, tortoises eventually floated, a few things maybe swam, but most of all the land animals, the only way of getting there was to come on vegetation mats that floated out of the mouth of the Zambezi River, floated across the Mozambique Channel, which would have taken about a month. And you had to have more than one animal on this vegetation mat, or at least a pregnant female, if you're going to come ashore in Madagascar and mate and reproduce. The odds of this happening are extremely long. And indeed, it only happened, as far as we know, for 4 groups of mammals, for the primates that would become lemurs, for the little insectivores that would become the Tenrechidae, for the carnivores that would become the members of the carnivore family on the island, and for rodents. As far as we know, the molecular evidence says that it only happened once for each of these groups. And it happened somewhere between, for the different groups, as you can see from this cartoon, between 60 and 22 million years ago. One of the kind of complexities of thinking about this stuff is that, you say, well, it happened between 20 and 60 million years ago, but actually, and that's true, but it's also the case, it happened one day or one night when some animals, very wet, bedraggled, and hungry, struggled ashore on the west coast of Madagascar, confronting this new land, and somehow made it their home, evolved, diversified on this continent-like island, and did tasks that we are accustomed to having done in other places by other kinds of animals. But Madagascar, in truth, had a very impoverished set of founders after the 66 million year old extinctions. And so nature kind of improvised with what was to hand. Anyway, there is a long story, and it's a fascinating story to do with that. But as I said, I'm mindful of the time, so let us keep going, moving on. So fast forward to 10,000 years ago, which is when we have the first faint trace of people in Madagascar. That trace comes from cut marks, probably made by stone tools on the leg bones of Aepyornis, 2 bones. That's 10,000 years ago. It would still make Madagascar the second most recently settled landmass in the world by humans. Come back to why the settlement of Madagascar is so recent. Then you go to 6,000 years ago, a few more bones there, but the first evidence of any sort of human living site is La Cotonyanza up in the Montagne des Français. This rock shelter was discovered and excavated by Bob and Chantal Radimilahi and Jean-Marie Rakutu-Arishua and Eli Razan and Malagasy students in the 2000s. It's actually a really lovely place. I could imagine camping up there, and there is a stream in the valley under it. There are a few Paleopropithecus jaw bones in the hearths there, but not much in the way of extinct megafauna bones. So the first people who were on the island 10,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and thereafter, almost certainly came across the Mozambique Channel from Africa, whether on purpose or by accident. But if you then move forward through the centuries, when you get to the 7th century, you start to see an increase in settlement around the coastal areas, and people are doing, particularly the south coast of Madagascar, and people are starting to farm. In the 10th century, cattle are introduced and goats. Looking at the genetic makeup of the Malagasy people today, it's about 60% Bantu and 40% Indonesian, Southeast Asian. So somewhere, and the genetic estimates would say around the 7th century, people start moving to Madagascar from Southeast Asia. So look at this map. How did they do it? And the answer is almost certainly some of them hitched rides with traders or were themselves traders who came around the rim of the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean was the trading center of the world for about 5,000 years. And some undoubtedly have come, got all the way to Madagascar and decided to stay there. But it also seems very likely that somewhere in the 8th century, traders were going, it took about 2 years to do the round trip from Southeast Asia to Madagascar. The monsoon winds blow in opposite directions and get you there and get you back, but it takes about 2 years. That there were people who were oppressed by a growing Malaysian empire in the 8th century here in Southeast Asia. And it was pretty brutal and pretty awful. And you could imagine the traders coming back and saying, well, you know, on the other side of that ocean, there is a place where there aren't many people, and there are wonderful natural resources there. And it is very likely that people using the western flowing current across the middle of the Indian Ocean fled from Southeast Asia, whole families fleeing and making their way by boat to Madagascar. The first boat people, if you will, early boat people. It is an interesting sort of feature of the genetic makeup of the Malagasy people that there is more Indonesian representation among women than among men. What that suggests is that the people coming from Africa were mainly men, or predominantly men. The people coming from Southeast Asia, from Indonesia, were entire families, women and men and children. So it's an amazing, amazing thought. So what did they do when they arrived? You will all know that the Malagasy language's closest relative is Manyan, which is spoken by people in the interior of Borneo, way upriver in Borneo, with no history of seafaring. So how does that become the lingua franca of an entire island? that's not knowable, but by the 16th, 17th century, everybody was speaking the Malagasy language in Madagascar. And my own sort of bet and argument is that a lot of that, if you're trading across the island, you need a lingua franca, and Malagasy became a lingua franca, and trade, internal trade, would have been an important part of what people did. They came, many of them would have been traders, and they came through trading routes. But it wasn't just domestic trading. Then, as today, quartz, the finest quartz in the world, the purest quartz in the world, comes from Madagascar, and quartz and soapstone and other minerals would almost certainly have been traded in an export trade. And Mahilaka in the 12th century, up near Majunga, was the first city in Madagascar, and it was a trading port. It was the point of entry and export for Madagascar's trade goods. So there's a long and rich history of trade, but of course that wasn't the only thing that was going on. This is a reconstruction of an abstracted site in the Central Highlands, where you see giant tortoises, a pygmy hippopotamus on the left, elephant birds in the distance, a giant lemur on the right in the foreground, one of 17 species of giant lemurs, all of them larger than any lemur alive today. We know now, thanks to the work of James Hansford, that there were 7 species of giant elephant birds, maybe more, 2, maybe 3 species of giant tortoises, 2, probably 3 species of hippopotamus. There's no evidence of any decline in the populations of any of these animals until about the 8th century in the Common Era. So what happened? People have been on Madagascar for the best part of 10,000 years. For 9,000, close to 9,000 of those years, there is no evidence that there was a problem for the megafauna of the island. There is an argument out there that we have sort of destruction in our DNA. It's a very dark view of the place of our species in the wild. I look at this and I say, no, it isn't the facts of Homo sapiens' existence. It is what we do. And therein lies hope. We have the capacity to change things. And I believe that this long occupation of this long presence of people in Madagascar alongside this megafauna with no evident decline, this is what the paleontologists tell us, looking at the abundance of subfossil bones, that this is grounds for hope. It's also grounds for rewriting the story of what happened when people arrived in Madagascar, because actually part of the answer is, well, for thousands of years, nothing much did happen. That notion that nothing much did happen is reinforced by the mapping of where subfossils have been found and human settlement sites. This map actually doesn't capture it as well as it could. The really strange and sort of perplexing reality is that most of these subfossils, most of the remains of these animals that are now extinct, do not come from human settlement sites. In fact, almost none come from human settlement sites. They come from sinkholes into which animals fell and died, drowned or were knocked out and or starved to death. There was no giant feast on these giant animals going on in human settlement sites. In the few places if you look at that site way down on the south coast. So what is that about? Well, actually, that somebody really liked eating tenrecs in that village. And so in that village, there is a rubbish pit dating to the 8th century with a lot of tenrecs in it. Well, tenrecs are still alive in Madagascar. So what are we to make? I didn't want to end my slides with a map. So I put up, this is a picture of the animals I study, because I just wanted you to see one of those. A male cowering down below and waiting for the females to finish feeding. Female social dominance in action. But anyway, what I wanted to say is, how do we explain the extinction of the megafauna in the absence of much evidence at all of hunting, just kind of marginal evidence of hunting? But there is enough work now to say that if animals are very big and they live at very low density, even a really incompetent hunter who misses most of the time and who only actually takes pot shot at animals rarely, if you do that for a few centuries, you eventually get the population level low enough that animals can't find mates and they lose the capacity to reproduce. And then the kind of trajectory of extinction speeds up. And by the 16th century, all of these big animals are gone, but it would have happened over a slow enough period, just as is the case today, that you are not aware of what is actually happening. In the case of the ratites, of the elephant birds, as you all know, it may not have been so much hunting as it was egg theft. There are a lot of remains of broken eggshell around, particularly around the coasts. So I have not done justice at all to this story, but I hope that you will see that it is a history of change. It's a history in which the role of people is complicated. It isn't a simple story of destruction by people. I believe it's of interest in its own right, but I also believe that it matters, not just for academic reasons, to gather up and replace the story of Paradise Lost, which is the paradigm with which we live about Madagascar, with a much more nuanced account of what happened. Because fundamentally, the story of Paradise Lost, the story of the Malagasy people arriving and destroying their environment, 90% of the forest having disappeared, which is still the number cited today. It's cited, widely by academics today, that 90% of Madagascar's original forest has disappeared. That number was first published by Perrier de la Bâtie in 1921. Actually, he published a bunch of numbers. His numbers range between 70% and 90%. It's a fictitious number. It's based on nothing. It was unknowable how much forest there was at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was unknowable how much had been lost. Perrier de la Bâtie made it up as part of his own, not I think consciously, but it was part of a narrative of loss caused by Malagasy people. And of course, it should be said, that was a convenient justification for the expropriation of Madagascar's natural assets by the young French colonial government. The British did this. It was done widely in colonial times around the world. The remarkable thing is that the story has stuck in Madagascar. We're still using the 90% number that was created a century ago and didn't mean anything then and doesn't mean anything now. We need a better story. We need a better narrative, better supported by evidence, because the story that's being told is a story of blame. And for Jamie and for all of us wanting to be helpful and to work in Madagascar, the only way that that's going to work, in my view, is by partnership. There needs to be a partnership. It is not are going to be something where a bunch of foreigners are saying, well, you really screwed up and we're going to help you sort things out. That's a terrible springboard for partnership for the future. And it also happens to be based on a really spurious account of the past. So anyway, so coming to, I want to start, but sort of writing this book, it became indeed the pursuit of wonder and magic. It was always partly trying to debunk this false, simple narrative that still prevails. But it also became, for me, kind of a contemplation of the power of stories to shape the way in which we view the world, what we choose, the evidence we choose to look for, how we take evidence and construct stories out of it. And also that the evidence on which I base my book is one kind of evidence that is not accessible to many people. The people that Jamie was showing us slides of, they've not seen the evidence of paleontology, but they have their own evidence of the lived experience of Madagascar. And we have to get better at learning to hear each other's evidence and the stories that we construct around it. So that's sort of where, so my book ended up with a sort of a first and a last chapter, that kind of sort of mull about these things, and which I believe to be important. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me. And as I said, I'm very daunted. So I'm happy to answer questions. So,
Alison, thank you so much for telling us that story and giving us some new insights into our shared understanding of Madagascar. And I think really poignant in the week that we celebrate Earth Day. And being informed is probably one of the most vital things for us to look to the future of not just protecting somewhere like Madagascar, but also developing somewhere like Madagascar. And I'm equally daunted by the shared expertise that we have around us on this Zoom call and in our wider diaspora. We need to go to questions now, and bear with me as I go through the gallery, but I do want to say a heartfelt thank you for that amazing presentation. And I feel I just sat and listened to an amazing story and that pieced together lots of bits of information that I sort of half knew, and wow, I feel much more enriched as a result. So let's hear from you. Teresa Hain, your hand is up.
Thank you for that. I am most interested in every way. Just a slight introduction. I forestalled you in Madagascar by 3 years because I first went there in 1967. But I've got about halfway through your book and absolutely fascinated. And I'm sure later on it tells it, but could you tell us a little bit more about what is known about the actual forest cover in the past? Because I'm always puzzled by this. I go across the Tampaketsa and see these great acres of nothing. But with these little, in the valley areas, these little bits of very interesting woodland and forest. So it must have been there at some stage.
Yes, I mean, so if the best real numbers that I can find would say that in the last 50 years, about 44% of the forest that existed 50 years ago has now gone. That is a daunting challenge in the present. But that is a very different matter from going further back into the past. The problem is that before you have aerial photography and before you have satellite images, and even when you have them, it's very difficult to estimate forest cover. And this is what Perrier de Valabati had neither. And so that number, we can just sort of forget about that number. And it's also sort of how far back do you want to go? If you go back 10,000 years, at the end of the ice ages, the Central Highlands would have looked very different. So again, you have to kind of lift your mind out of the notion of Madagascar as a timeless, unchanging place. It was always a place of dynamism. If you look at the grasses of Madagascar, there is as high a proportion of endemic grasses and as great a diversity of endemic grasses as there is in Tanzania, in the great grasslands of Tanzania. So, and these grasses, their origin goes back 4 to 7 million years ago. You know, Kew is doing the work on this. There are great botanists at Kew working with Malagasy collaborators to tell this story of grassland. It was there. What was its extent? That's not knowable at the moment, and its extent would have waxed and waned over time. So again, it's sort of there is a very complicated and interesting history that is still being unpacked. It doesn't negate the challenge of what is happening now, that you've seen, that I've seen, we've all seen. But it puts it in a context, I think, that shifts the way in which one thinks about it. And it's certainly, you know, I mean, since Perrier de la Bâtie said that 90% of the forest had disappeared, or 70% in some of his publications, he actually changed his numbers if you read him carefully. And we say 90% has disappeared today. That's really good news. No forest has disappeared in the last century. And it's rubbish, rubbish, rubbish. We've got to get better data. We've got to get better info.
Thanks, Teresa. Julia Jones, your hand is up.
This is so hello. It's so, I see all these faces that I know on these screens. You're all an inch high, which is very frustrating. But anyway, hello, Julia.
Hello, Alison. Thank you for a fantastic talk. So I've just finished your book, loved it, and I'm here in Madagascar with a copy, and will of course hand it over to a colleague here. But I was wondering, how can Malagasy colleagues in Madagascar get hold of the book? Because I know many would really love to read it.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm going to be bringing a lot with me. Secondly, I mean, there are many contributors, as you know, Malagasy contributors, and they are all being sent copies as I speak. And some of them have arrived and some of them have not. It will be, well, we're working, I hope it will get translated into French, and then with a French publisher who will properly distribute it in Madagascar. I mean, that's the other way that it will get there. But in order for it to get translated into French, it has to have enough sales. I'm not interested in sort of self-promotion, but I am really interested in this book getting read, because it matters for people to think differently about Madagascar. Anyway, it's clearly, if this is just a book for expats, then an interested sort of, armchair travelers, that's not good enough. Anyway, and thank you for all you did reading drafts, Julia.
Thank you.
Well, there's 50 of us here, so those of us who haven't got a copy, there's a call to action, right? Martin,
thank you.
Martin Hampstead, our esteemed treasurer, your hand is up.
Thank you. Until I read this book, I'd been labouring under the impression that I probably built in the 60s when I first went to Madagascar, that the human beings had only been on the island for no more than 2,000 years. But this book puts a very different feeling to the human being, and I have to excuse myself because there's a lot in the book that was well over my head, but there are some things I could relate to. And the idea that people came from Indonesia in about 700 AD, and then some people came across from Africa in the years following, seems to be almost destroyed, with the utmost respect, by what Alison has put in her book.
Oh, no, it isn't. I mean, you're right. And there's very strong evidence of people coming from Indonesia in the 7th, 8th century and into the 10th century. And but it is just that the early settlement from Africa goes back, 9,000 years earlier than that. We're finding far earlier traces of people there. So it expands the story of what happened rather than sort of overturns it in terms of the settlement history.
Do you think, Alison, that adds to the legend of the Vazimba, the proto-Malagasy that one hears about in Madagascar?
Yes. I mean, that's what does that represent? There is some linguistic evidence of a pre-Bantu language speakers, but linguists argue about whether that evidence is good or not. But the Vazimba arguably could be an even earlier pre-Bantu people.
Amazing.
Who knows? Anyway.
I'm pleased to say that in the chat box on this, there's lots of questions on where can we buy copies of the book. Now, Teresa has outed herself as an Amazon shopper, but I'm sure other major retailers carry your book, right, Alison?
Yes. Any a friendly bookshop near you, if you're in the UK. If you're in Madagascar, not yet, but Julia's point is noted, indeed noted.
Great. Now I can see
I see Jane's hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and me too. I've reset my historical perspectives about Madagascar. But has there been much work done on pollen analysis? Because I mean, I think the issue about forest cover is indeed fascinating, and like Teresa was saying, there are these pockets of forest that look as if they're remnants that have clung on from greater forest cover. But surely pollen analysis and these wonderful people who look at bits of mites in peat and stuff like that could actually answer that question. Is anyone doing that?
I mean, well, so just sort of two pieces of this. Some of those very strange islands of forest in the Central Highlands that look as if they ought to have been part of larger forests. Some of them actually, they harbor species of mouse lemurs that demonstrate that they have been island forests maintained by natural fire for millions of years. So not everything that looks like a fragment is a human-induced fragment, if you will. So there is sort of interesting sort of genetic data coming from mouse lemurs in particular on that issue. So on the pollen, yeah, I mean the pollen analysis takes you back 125,000 years max. There are no cores that go back earlier than that. And they tell a story. I mean, this is where the story of the sort of what was happening in the Central Highlands, if you go back 12,000 years ago to the end of the last glacial cycle, those Central Highlands were heath. There was no forest there. It was cold and it was chilly. And then what you see through the pollens is the heath slowly being replaced by grasses. And then you see the grasses, trees encroaching on the grasses. And then a pullback. I mean, there are sort of spikes of back and forth, the boundary between forest and woodland and open grassland around Lake Chichivarkeli, where this core comes from, pollen core comes from. It was in constant motion. Where you see a real change in the Central Highlands in the pollen core is not until the 12th century. And in the 12th century, you start to see crop weeds, crops of pollen, weed pollen associated with cultivation, and a decline in woody species. So the pollen tells you that the Central Highlands, and the archaeological evidence tells you that the Central Highlands were not occupied until around the 12th century. But yes, but the story is still being told. I mean, whatever I've written, it's going to be rewritten by me or somebody else not too many years into the future. And that's part of what's so exciting now, is that there is a generation of Malagasy scientists and conservation biologists that just didn't exist when we began. The old folk began in, when I began in 1970, because they'd all been somebody's research assistant, right? Some colonial researcher's research assistant. And there was no effort to have a leadership group in Madagascar. That's transforming now, and it's great. And there's a lot of research going on. So, so what I'm telling you will, it'll be out of date before too long, I think.
David Ashley, your question, sir.
Thanks very much. And thanks very much, Alison, for a great talk. I look forward to reading the book, and also look forward to seeing you in Tanna before too long.
In August.
August.
Yes.
So I look forward to it. You'll be very welcome. Question about birds, if I may. As sort of some of you may know, kind of I'm very fond of Malagasy birds, but the relative paucity or of density of birds kind of slightly surprises me. And I wonder if there's any explanation for that, if indeed that's true. Kind of, is that a recent development, or is it just? I'm just surprised that the more haven't evolved over the time period where, given it was relatively easy for birds as opposed to other species to get to Madagascar. So
you posed a really interesting question, and I'm not a bird person, so anyway. But so yes, I mean, what is interesting about the birds of Madagascar is that the levels of endemicity are high. But the diversity of birds is low compared to other land masses of Madagascar's size. And there is some really interesting absences. You would expect there to be honey guides. You would expect there to be woodpecker-like. There's a list of birds, families that you would expect to have made it over from Africa that didn't. And so, so why is it weird? Why is it odd? Because, as you say, you would think they would have flown across. My own strong belief is that there was a second filter for everything that was coming to Madagascar, and that second filter is the extreme unpredictability. As we know, drought, which is what is afflicting southern Madagascar at the moment. I mean, there is, Jamie was talking about the cyclone. There is another sort of tale of disaster and suffering associated with what's going on in the south at the moment. But those droughts happen at unpredictable intervals every decade or 2 or 3 in Madagascar, and have done for a very long time. They're probably happening more frequently and for longer because of global climate change. But those unpredictable failures of rainfall go back deep in time. And in the east, it isn't that the rainfall is highly unpredictable from year to year, but within sort of the pattern of rainfall during months. Unpredictability is difficult for animals to cope with, and humans. If you plant crops and they die, you're an animal, you give birth, and your young die because the rain hasn't fallen, there is no food. If you look at Madagascar's fauna, they actually, as a fauna, show very interesting adaptations to coping with unpredictability. Basically, you've got 2 choices. You speed your life up and take advantage of good conditions, or you hedge your bets and spread your life out over very long periods and don't put too many eggs in any one basket. So the lemurs, the shifak that I study, I mean, these animals are the size of a small cat, right? And at least half of the females where I work haven't given birth for the first time by the time they're 7 years old, and they live till they're 30. They're living their lives in the slow lane. And you can look out across all of the mammals and you see indications of sort of weirdness in life history. My bet is that birds have weird life histories too, but nobody's really looked at that. and that what we'll find is that it actually takes kind of luck and the luck of natural selection to find ways of dealing with this. Anyway, that I would love to work with ornithologists who would pursue this, and you put your finger on a really interesting and not understood issue.
Mark, I can see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Hi. Alison, fantastic talk. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And I actually just would add from the reptile and amphibian side that, of course, we also have a lot of very weird life history going on in species in Madagascar.
Oh, great. Is that, I didn't know that.
Year and frogs that have extremely explosive reproductive events and then disappear for the rest of the year. So we've got all kinds of fascinating reptiles and amphibians.
So my favorite is the Martin Little, is the tenrex, that where females grow, they're born, they grow up, and within a year they give birth to 29 young, and then they die. And this is a mammal. They're not, mammals aren't supposed to do that. And
yeah.
Anyway, and the same with the chameleon. I mean, there is these great weird animals that are sort of not behaving properly.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad to add frogs. That's great.
Yes, very much so. But actually, my main question is about, so you mentioned at the start of your talk about obviously Beelzebufo, also a frog, a fascinating fossil, and the whole community of unusual animals that was around then. And then we have this big gap, followed by pollen cores going back to a few 100,000 years, subfossils that are also tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. But we have something like 60 million years of blank, where everything that we're inferring about the colonization history, the diversification history of the lemurs, the birds, the reptiles, the amphibians, and all of the plants and everything is all based on reconstructions, of course, from what we've got today. Do you hold out any hope that we will find anything like a fossil bed that might hold some of the answers to the big questions that we keep battering our heads about?
Of course I hold out hope. You can't despair, right? But and it's actually even worse than you say. I mean, the subfossils don't go back hundreds of thousands of years. They go back maybe 25,000 years. And the best pollen core goes back 150,000 years, but that's not well dated. And Mark is absolutely right. Everything we know comes from now increasingly molecular evidence from living creatures, which means that if anything arrived and didn't make it to the present, doesn't have any descendants in the present, we have no way of knowing it existed at all. So it's a very it's a very conditional reconstruction of the past. So it is a curious thing that the problem is that nobody has yet found fossil-bearing exposed strata for the last 66 million years in Madagascar. The fossils I was talking about, they come from fossil-bearing layers of geological layers. It's a kind of quirk of geological history. But, I was talking, Henry Wright thinks it's because people haven't looked hard enough in the right places.
Yes, I was wondering the same.
Yeah, and there are people who are now looking hard, but not yet. I mean, Karen Salmons and her group, they have found some earlier stratigraphic fossil-bearing stuff, but it's on a little island off the coast, and it's mostly a marine fauna. But it is just very odd. And it does make you realize how lucky we are that there are places in the world where there are such extraordinarily rich fossil-bearing sites. It ain't necessarily so. Yeah, but it would be so great. I mean, it has to happen. When you look at the Majunga Basin fauna from 68 million years ago, what you can tell if you actually have fossils in your hands, because you can figure out how these animals lived. And when all you've got is just sort of a molecular phylogeny, and based on living animals, can't tell very much at all from that, other than projecting them back in time as existing.
Thank you. Is there any more, are there any more questions? If not, as Alison rightly said, it's your Saturday afternoon, your Saturday evening. I appreciate we've been together now for coming close to 2 hours. We could go on. It's a joy. And I look forward to the talk about the discovery of the fossil bed and everything that has been mentioned. We lost a couple of participants halfway through to Tanner power cuts. So we very much want to thank our speakers, Alison, Richard, all the way from Connecticut, Jamie Spencer, all the way from Fianarantsoa, and you, the members, joining from all over, some from airplanes, some from football matches, some of you new members, some of you long-term members. Some of you would-be members, please join. This is where I do our pitch. We are here for you. The Anglo-Malagasy Society is made up of its members, and we have more talks on the way. So a couple of dates for your diaries. On the 29th of June, we're meeting in person, and we're meeting in person at St. George's Church in Bloomsbury. We'll be celebrating the 62nd Independence Day for Madagascar, and we're continuing a literary theme. John Gimlet is going to enthrall us with his tales of adventure in researching his latest book, The Gardens of Mars, Madagascar, an Island Story. Doors will open at 6:30, 7 o'clock start. It will mainly be drinks and some snacks, because we're going to be enthralled by the talk. And then a second date for you, 29 is a theme. The 29th of October in London, same venue, we'll be having our full day meeting. We very much do hope to have another virtual meeting this year so that you can join as we have today. Thank you all for joining. But again, thank you to both our speakers for just such an exciting afternoon of talks.